we'll start with Scott McCloud. There's a little glare on that page. It's okay. I'm gonna just start flipping through the book and point out some stuff that I think is especially worthy of our attention. But if I flip past a page where you have a question or you have something you want to say, go ahead and stop me and jump into the conversation. Marlon's asking in the chat, when should we get Rusty Brown? Soon. You'll need Rusty Brown as soon as we're done with both of these books. So that's only going to be about 2 weeks from now, 3 at the most. So good thing you reminded me, because yeah, we'll need to have Rusty Brown in hand, ready to go as soon as we run out of these 2. I have found from teaching this book over years and years in the past that most people enjoy Scott McCloud and get useful concepts out of it. Well, I like Scott McCloud too, although after working with this book for several decades now, I know in great detail what I like about Scott McCloud and what I agree with and what I have some reservations about. The introduction page is sort of cute. Aren't you kind of young to be doing that sort of thing? Yeah, he was kind of young back in 1993. Not so much anymore. Matt Feasel, who he's talking to, is a guy worth Googling up to look at some of his work online. Matt Feasel his artwork is drawn in such a minimal style that I really think this kind of drawing is accessible to anybody. If you think you can't do comics, look up Matt Feasel's work. I promise you, cross my heart, you can draw comics as well as Matt Feasel can. And chapter 1. I am doing a share screen where I'm showing the Scott McCloud book and my hand is also showing up. And Marlon says he can't see it. Can everybody else see it?
I can see it.
Okay. It seems like it might just be a you problem, Marlon, on your end. I'm sorry. I'll announce the page numbers every so often, and if you have the book with you, you can turn to that page. All right, so I'm looking at page 2, where chapter 1 starts. He in his earliest childhood, he thought comics were stupid. And then only as he got a little older did he realize, oh, there's something here, which is a little bit opposite to the way most people do it. Most people read comics when they're kids and then give comics up when they come to adulthood because, like, comics are kids stuff. But as he points out on page 3, it doesn't have to be that way. Sure, comic books were usually crude, poorly drawn, semi-literate, cheap, disposable kiddie fare, but they don't have to be. And on the very next page, I like this panel number 1 on page 4 very much, where he draws this like globe and then fills in all of these squares on the globe with the immense variety of different comic characters. Most of these are at least a little bit familiar to me. There's some that I don't recognize at all, but it's an illustration of the amount of background reading that Scott McCloud has done. All right. So then his next goal as an author, as an explainer of comics, is to come up with a definition of what comics is. This is where one of the most important concepts dealt with in this book is first broached. The distinction between a medium and a genre, okay? Comics is a medium, a superhero is a genre. Miranda, glad you could make it. I am marking it down that you are here.
Thank you.
I am gonna, well, maybe I shouldn't assume that everybody knows what genre means. I've got a little video on the subject of genre. So I will assign that for this week's viewing to watch my quick and dirty intro to genre. You know how if you walk into a bookstore, the books aren't all just lined up on one big shelf. There are different sections in the bookstore, all right? Those roughly correspond to genres. There'll be a section called literature and another section called science fiction and another section maybe called mystery. All of those are genres. Specifically, those are subgenres of fiction. And then there will also be a nonfiction section and a poetry section, and those are genres as well, sort of larger scale genres than the science fiction and mystery. And that's what's going on here. Scott McCloud and me as well, and anybody who studies comics seriously, wants to make sure that comics doesn't get lumped in as a genre, because any genre is possible to deal with within comics. So the visual metaphor that he's got for that is he's like, comics is the container, but the container can contain any kind of thing.
So yeah, comics is just kind of like it's the same thing with like animation, where it's like that is just how you do. Yeah, that's how you tell a story. That's how you tell a story. It's like
That's
you
the
wouldn't
delivery.
say, yeah, like you wouldn't say a novel is a genre kind of thing.
Well, actually, I would.
That novel is a genre.
Yes, but it's a sort of a large scale genre. Like there's a difference between a novel and a short story, right?
Yeah.
And there's a difference between a novel and an interpretive dance. Oh, sorry, you're right. I'm slopping over into medium. There are subgenres of novel. Okay, there are fantasy novels and there are realistic novels. But novel can still be contrasted at a higher level of abstraction. Novel can be contrasted with poem or play.
Or like a memoir?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a difference between a novel and a memoir. And that difference is a genre difference. Good job, Miranda.
Okay, and
You
let's
popped
say
up with exactly the right example.
yeah. No, I was gonna say, so if that's the case, then if let's say we're looking at the category of novel and we're looking at the subgenres, the subgenres can be divided to two, which is fiction and nonfiction, right?
That's a misunderstanding of the word novel. Novel means fiction only.
Ooh.
A lot of people have the idea that novel means any book, but that's not the case. So we don't have a word that's as compact and easy to use as novel to describe book length nonfiction, unfortunately. You just have to say book length nonfiction, or else get specific about your subgenre as memoir, biography, travel writing, whatever, different kinds of nonfiction that you would have that would be as long as a book. I didn't mean to get sidetracked into that, but it's something I feel strongly about. People need to realize that novel does not equal the same thing as book. The distinction between a genre and a medium might not be quite as clear cut as Scott McCloud is making it out to be, but as kind of like a general way of thinking about it and thinking of comics as being a medium and not a genre, I think this is very valuable. And then he, having already used the symbol of like a container that can be filled with anything you want to fill it with, right? Then he contrasts comics, a medium, with other media, such as theater, the written word, which would include both novels and nonfiction books and poetry and plays that are printed as writing rather than, acted out. All of those things are the written word. And then you would contrast that kind of medium for presenting these things to this other kind, like theater, which means you go to this place and live human beings act it out in front of you, right? And that's another medium. But again, there could be different genres within that. You could have people at the theater acting out tragedies or comedies, different genres within theater. Okay. This is really key, and almost everybody in the world agrees with Scott McCloud that comics should be regarded as a medium and not a genre. So this is a place where he made a real impact on the field of comics studies. Then he gets into his attempt to have a formal definition of what comics actually is. Yeah. This is an area where, if it interests you, if the idea of creating formal definitions and either like ruling things in or ruling things out is exciting for you, you'll want to do some additional reading beyond Scott McCloud, because a lot of people have said a lot more things since he came out with his definition and arguing with parts of it and tweaking it in various ways. For one thing, if your job is to create a definition, the definition has got to do two things. It's like a Venn diagram, right? We want everything inside of the circle to meet the definition. And the definition has to be inclusive enough to get everything into the Venn diagram that we want in there, that we want to call comics. But it also needs to be restrictive enough to exclude everything that we wouldn't regard as comics, right? So it's got to let in the right things, but also keep out the right things. And those are the two aspects of the definition. Scott McCloud includes a lot more stuff than some people would. The reason he's standing right here on the timeline of the turn of the 20th century is because that is the time when newspaper comics in the US began. And that was a big, big deal in the history of comics. And if that hadn't happened, who knows if we would have even ever had such a thing as comic books at all. But it did happen, people who study comics for this is how they make their living as scholars. There are a lot of them that do make the cutoff here. Like, okay, this is where the beginning of comics in history is. a lot of people would not take these Mayan codices and say, yeah, that's comics too. The Bayeux Tapestry. It combines words and pictures on the same surface, but it's different from how we usually think of comics in a couple of ways. And one of the ways is, instead of it being a page, it's fabric. This is like woven. So do we want to stretch the definition of comics so far that it includes woven things in addition to like ink on page type things? Or do we not? Another thing that's different about the Bayeux Tapestry versus the kind of comics that we're reading in this class, there's only one of it. This is an object that can only be in one place. You know, there's only one of it hanging in a museum somewhere in France, I'm guessing, although I don't know. Whereas the comics that I'm assigning to you guys, you know, it's reproducible. Everybody in class has their own copy of these comics. And some people who study it say that is one of the things that makes the medium what it is, that it is reproducible and that there are multiple copies and that you can buy them fairly cheaply. That doesn't compare in any way to an artwork where there is only one of it, and it would either have to be in a museum or you would have to be fabulously wealthy to own it in your own home. Okay. And again, with some of these Egyptian things, it's not ink on the page, it's inscriptions on stone temples. And then he's like, even though he wanted to start back way earlier on the timeline than other people, he does recognize that the invention of printing is an important moment in the history of comics, even if you define it as expansively as he does and include all of these other things inside the circle that a lot of people would not. And this is a way of looking at what I might call sequential art. In comics, you know, the story or the whatever is presented by a sequence of panels. That kind of thing was not invented. To have a sequence, a story being presented in a sequence of individual pictures, that was definitely not invented only at the beginning of the 20th century, because painters had done that kind of thing in previous centuries. You can have multiple canvases, for instance, altarpieces or stained glass windows in church, that kind of thing, that tell the story of the crucifixion in a series of panels, right? First this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. The Stations of the Cross, right? It's 12 different, or is it 14 different? And you know, churches since forever, since there were churches, show this story in a sequence of images, particularly useful in times when most people couldn't read. So anyway, so that aspect of how comics works is not new and predates the printing press. And then, as McCloud himself admits, you know, something significant happens and there's an explosion of new art forms right here when newspaper comics became a feature of the American newspaper at this time in history. Okay. I'm on page 18. Right here, this panel, and he doesn't make a big deal of it, but if you look in the background, of panel number 3 on page 18. McCloud is implicitly claiming that all of these things he's showing you here behind him on the wall ought to count as comics. Well, he's including here people who are famous for creating children's picture books. Shel Silverstein, and right down here, In the Night Kitchen by Maurice Sendak. For a lot of people, including me, this is an undesirable effect of McCloud making his definition as expansive as he does. For me, kids' picture books ought to come down outside the circle of what comics is. It's a different, it's a different medium, or at least like the people who buy children's picture books and the people who buy comics, there's not, they're created for different purposes with different audiences in mind, and there's a different publishing tradition. And it doesn't seem quite right to me to say, oh yeah, no, there's no significant difference between the comics and kids' picture books. But McCloud is perfectly happy to collapse those two categories together. And there could be, for me, mind you, I'm drawing my own Venn diagram here. There is an intersection. I mean, there are kids' picture books that are done as comics, but there's definitely stuff in here too that I would say, yeah, that meets my criteria for being a children's picture book, but not my criteria for being a comic. And that doesn't mean I can necessarily give a perfect definition that divides the comics from the non-comics. But I'm like, I know it when I see it. And this is not that. All right. Here is another consequence of McCloud putting the definition exactly the way he has. On page 20, this here is a single panel cartoon. I don't know if this comic is still around. I think maybe it is, Family Circus. Are people familiar with that particular newspaper comic, The Family Circus? I think the guy who originally drew the comic when I was young passed it on to his son. I think his son is still drawing it. Anyway, there are newspaper comics. The Far Side is another example. That is always just one panel. And according to McCloud, because you have to have juxtaposition, anything that only has one panel in it doesn't get to be a comic. So on the one hand, McCloud's definition is including kids' picture books, which I would prefer to exclude. On the other hand, it's excluding single panel comics. Single panel, I'll call it, so I don't prejudice the issue, I'll call it single panel cartoons. Are single panel cartoons comics? Well, if you think they are, you're going to have to mess with Scott McCloud's definition so that you can get them to the inside of your circle. Yeah, Marlon says he's familiar with Family Circus because of Linda Berry. Yes, Linda Berry was a big fan of Family Circus. And Matthew just now looked it up, Matthew Martinez looked it up and says, yep, it's still coming out. And Savannah has heard of it and seen it when she used to get the newspaper. Yeah, that's the thing. Newspapers themselves are going out of business. You know, in a generation or two, there won't be such a thing as print newspapers anymore. And that will have an effect on comics. Okay.
It's actually
Go ahead.
kind of odd that he would exclude single panel cartoons because aren't technically children's picture books single panel? Like some of the ones I read as a
Well,
kid.
each page,
Yeah.
usually the typical children's picture book, you could interpret each page as being panel-like, because there's just one, you know, and the edges of the page are like the panel border, etc. So, but there's a bunch of pages. I mean, a children's picture book doesn't include just one page in it. So if you like, if you wanted to assimilate those two categories, that's what you would have to do. You know, each page is equivalent to a panel, and it's the pages that are juxtaposed. All right. On the top of page 22, again, trying to reinforce his basic idea that there's a difference between genre and medium, and keep it firmly in your mind that comics is a medium and not a genre. And here's a bunch of his examples of genres, okay? Any one of these things could be handled in comics form, you know. You can have comic book pornography. You can have comic book folk tales or fairy tales or traditional stories. You can have comic book historical fiction. You can have comic book mysteries. Nothing is ruled out. And per his definition, nothing is said about paper and ink. Nothing is said about printing process. You could just as well do your comic in the form of take a chisel out to the cliff face and chisel your comic into the rock. And for McCloud, that would be just as much a comic as any of his other examples. As I explained, yeah.
Oh, sorry, but there's also the fact that many comics and animation are done in computers, completely computerized. No,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, when I say paper and ink, I'm showing my age, aren't I? Paper and ink are not required anymore. You can use basically virtual surfaces to stand in for the paper and move in pixels around by whatever method. And that stands in for what used to be ink or pencil.
I was gonna say that because I guess in your definition, a comic has to be, or at least for some people, it has to be reproducible, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
So if an artist made a, like, I don't know, like a little comic on his sketchbook, does that make it less of a comic?
Well, the way I would probably handle that is I would say that's a non-published comic. But yeah, you're right. And this is the problem with definition. You know, once you start poking at them, it's not difficult at all to find or create a bunch of holes. Like, and what do you do with this tricky edge case? And that's one reason I don't specifically like to dwell on definitions as such. But I admire people that are willing to wade in like Scott McCloud was, and he got the ball rolling. I think there's actually, there's no way to create a purely formal definition that will do everything you want it to do, to exclude everything that should not be in the collection and include everything that should be in the collection. For my class, for purposes of this class, I like to say that the object of study for us is not comics per se, but all art forms that include the possibility of combining words and pictures together. And so that way I'm able to throw a really big tent, right? Whether it's comics or not. Here's another tricky question. Is manga different from comics, or is it all the same thing?
I think it's a different medium because like there's
I kind of honestly say it's the same thing.
I would
Okay.
I would say
argue
it's different because like there's manga and then we have comics and then we have graphic literature, which is where I think I don't know, it's just mangas comes from Japan, and Japan has like a different like reading
There's
sequence and
certainly
everything.
a lot of different traditions. And people can like manga without liking American comics and vice versa. But is what we're dealing with there a medium difference or a genre difference?
I'd argue genre, but then again, you could have genres within manga.
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot of different ones.
I would say it's like an offshoot of comics. Like still like the same
Well-
ballpark, but it's has its own little niche.
Yeah. I am not deeply familiar with manga and its traditions, so I'm going to get out of my depth pretty quickly if we go there. But I think that to an extent, I mean, in the modern world, you know, there's a global culture and people have access to cultural products of all cultures. You know, and people who are living and working and creating things and reading things in Japan can see American comics and vice versa. So there's influences that run in both directions. But I think to some extent, manga has its roots. It's almost like a parallel evolution kind of thing. There's something in the chat. Okay, Miranda says it's a medium difference. How come, Miranda? Manga and comics, you argue, are two different media.
Yeah, I mean because like if manga was like the same, was a genre, I mean like I think one of my classmates said like a manga has like subgenres inside of it, and like Japan has its own like reading sequence, and like I would say
Yeah.
manga and comics, they're like cousins.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
I'm-
And if I have to like keep it a little further off, I would even say like manga and comics, they're like English and Spanish.
Good. That is an interesting angle to take on it. And there is at least one comics expert that says exactly the same as you, that that there are different languages of comics.
Who was that? Who is it?
Neil Cohn.
Neil Cohn?
Yeah. I'll make a note of that and put it on the chat. It's spelled like this, Neilcohn. He wrote a book about 10 years ago now called The Visual Language of Comics, and also another one that came out just a couple of years ago. So that's yet another sort of axis along which things can vary. There's a medium in the sense of, well, is it comics or is it interpretive dance? And then there's medium in the sense of which language are we using? You know, a novel is a genre in the larger category of printed literature. But novels can be printed in English or in French or in Spanish or in whatever language, you know, and translated. And this dude, Neil Cohn, argues that what he calls American visual language and Japanese visual language roughly corresponds to manga versus US comics. He nicknames the US version Kirby-an. All right. I think that these images that he has on page 22 and 23 are kind of inspiring. Just the visual symbolism of it, of all of these different worlds that could be, and he shows himself positioned on that same globe that we saw before here on page 23, and that's the same globe from page 4. Many possible worlds. I find that quite thrilling. All right. The most important idea in chapter 2 is the concept of iconic abstraction. Okay. By now, everybody should have watched my video on the ladder of abstraction. So this is coming at the idea of abstraction from 2 different angles. The ladder of abstraction, as I presented it to you on that video, is about words and different types of words having a different amount of scope. The relationship between a word like rifle and a word like weapon, obviously there's a relationship, right? And the one word is, in a sense, a subset of the other category. So when you're going up the ladder, you are increasing in abstraction from rifle to weapon. When you come down the ladder, you are increasing in specificity. What type of weapon? Well, a rifle. Something similar to that is going on here. This is like a ladder of abstraction laid on its side, right? The degree of specificity involved in a photograph. A photograph shows you exactly one person. You look at that photograph and that's that guy. It's not anybody other than that guy, unless maybe if he had an identical twin or identical triplet or whatever, but this picture can only represent him. Okay. Moving to the rightward, abstracting away from the photograph to this drawing. Only some of the information contained in that photo is retained in this drawing, but a pretty fair amount of it is, but not all of it. And there are a lot more people in the world that you could say that that drawing accurately represents than there are that the photograph represents. And so on as you move to the right. Each time you're losing information in a way, but gaining in coverage in a way. And when you abstract it all the way to this, and you've got just this circle and these dots and this line left, and that's a face, that could be anybody's face. We read this as iconically representing any human face. This could only be one guy. This is any man, any human.
Can I mention, because like I actually read the chapters and like
Yeah.
I found it very interesting that the more abstraction you put in, the more of like you see in yourself.
Well, that's McCloud's argument.
Yeah, that's mccloud's argument.
Um,
I don't know. I found that chapter to be like actually like very like
yeah,
confusing
and
and like interesting.
it's The thing I both love and hate about mccloud is he's willing to speculate wildly. He's willing to make these kind of extreme claims all over the place. And some of them are very easy to debunk, and people have debunked them. But I love it that he has the courage to be wrong, you know? So let's try this. Let's see if this works. This is extremely important, the idea of abstraction, and that the process of iconic abstraction, or the like fact of comics, because most people, it takes a long time to draw something like this, way more time than it takes to draw something like this. This is deeply labor intensive. If for your purposes, you can make less be just as good, or even in some ways, maybe less is more. The willingness of the human brain to say, yeah, that's good enough. I will interpret that as a face. And as mccloud points out, you can't even, if you try, you can't not see that as a face, right? In the subsequent pages, he shows some other examples of things that we're like pre-programmed to see faces everywhere. You look at that, yeah, looks like a face to me. A little screamy face. And here you can't not see a face in the car headlights and grill on page 33. You can't not see a face in the top of the Kraft cheese Parmesan sprinkler. This is part of how the comics medium works, is what I'm trying to say. There's something about the way the human brain works that interacts with the iconic abstraction of comics, that even something like this is able to have an emotional impact on us, even though in our real life, what we see around us is this. So it should be stuff like this and like this that is all that could make get our emotions cranking, right? And yet that's not the case. Something even just like this will do it in the right context. So I think that is very much worth pointing out, and Scott mccloud dwelling on it. But I don't necessarily go along with every single detail of his explanation. I don't think he's right that it's specifically because this is so abstract that people can identify with it. And the reason I don't think that's correct is we identify with movie stars all the time. And that's this, right? That's this level of specificity, you know? You know, you're not Jennifer Lopez, and yet when she's on the screen, you're able to put yourself into that character somehow. Or whoever, substitute your favorite movie star. I don't know who that is, Nicolas Cage. All right, this claim on page 31. That somehow having a very abstract thing like this that leaves out almost all of the information is better and invites involvement more than a very concrete thing. You know, I can't go along with that. In general, when you're creating literary art of some kind, more specific is better than being vague. We'll come back to this again, I'm sure. In the next pages, when he talks about your face being a mask. Here, I think there's something quite significant going on. And in my own mind, there's a connection between this and Noreen Graff. I didn't make it a question on the reading rewards, but I did kind of point it out that Noreen Graff has drawn her narrator character in this very, very, very abstract way, like this, just a smiley face type thing, except she's got glasses on it too, but that's it. And that's her, for purposes of the comic, even though every other character is drawn more specifically and more concretely with less abstraction going on. And like, why is that? She's up to something. Well, you know, when we're dealing with other people, we always see their face. When we're just dealing with ourselves, we don't see the face. We feel it from behind, like mccloud is talking about. So our relationship with our face is way different from our relationship with everybody else's face. Okay. I think there are some really useful things that he says on page 41 about the different effects of cartooniness and more realistic drawing. And the concept of masking, and he points out that this is a feature of manga in particular, where there's a tradition of the more realistic drawing of the settings and more abstract drawings of the main character, which he's got this useful little mnemonic device. One set of lines to C, another set of lines to B. Okay, I'm going to stop right there for mccloud and turn to Persepolis just very briefly.